G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today we begin a two-part series about the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. In this episode, I talk with Holocaust survivor Peter Gasper. The Holocaust occurred from 1941 to 1945, and its mental health impacts are rarely talked about. Peter was born in 1937 in Czechoslovakia. Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Eventually, Peter was separated from his parents and sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. In this episode, Peter talks about the impact this had on him as a young child, and how it even affects him today. He gives a unique historical and generational perspective into mental health. Hello, Peter, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Hello, how are you?
Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I was born in 1937 in Bratislava, which was then Czechoslovakia, but it's now Slovakia. To a middle-class family. Dad had a job in an insurance company. Mum was a homemaker, as we were in those days. We were Jewish, but we were never religious. And I had a very pleasant and privileged childhood until the age of 5, when the Holocaust started to impact on me, and it got worse from there on. I was my first experience of the Holocaust was, well, apart from the sort of tension which I felt around the home, but I didn't understand what it was all about. I was 3-4 years old. But at the age of 5, I was sent home from school because I was Jewish, and I was told never to come back because Jews were not entitled to an education. And then we went. We were. My dad, mum and dad arranged for us to go into hiding because all my grandparents, whom I never knew, and my uncles and aunts were suddenly disappeared from my life. And again, I didn't know why, because I wasn't told the truth, and I didn't find out the truth until after the war. But they disappeared from my life, and I never saw them again. We were in hiding for about 3 years. We were in a concentration camp in Theresienstadt for about 6 months. Mum and Dad went to another camp in Germany as a slave laborer in an aircraft factory. So he, being a mechanical engineer, he was useful to the German war effort. And as a slave laborer, it kept him alive. If you were useful, you were kept alive. If you were not useful, you were done away with. After the war, so in May 1945, we came home, and Dad eventually came home. We struggled to recover our health, physical and mental, emotional. A lot of grief for my parents, a lot of grief to contend with. I eventually went back to school, and in 1949, we came to Australia, Mum and Dad and I. I've always been an only child. So that is basically my history prior to coming to Australia.
What other memories do you have around that time when Czechoslovakia was under German occupation?
Well, we had to start wearing stars, the Jewish Star of David on our outer clothing to identify us. We had to wear that on the outside of our on the outer garment. All kinds of restrictions were put on us. No restaurants or theaters. No walking on the pavement. We had to walk on the street. We couldn't use public transport. We couldn't sit on park benches. And that is I've still got the remnants of that, or the traces of that in my life today.
How do those restrictions affect you mentally as a young boy?
Well, as a young boy, look, you deal with it. I mean, you don't think about it. It's what you're told to do or not to do, and that's it. And I don't remember it as being traumatizing in any way. Not that I knew that word or I understood that word at the time. Being sent home from school, that was difficult. That really mattered because that meant that I lost a lot of friends. I had no contact with children for 3 years while we were in hiding, and those years in hiding were very restrictive. I remember being told time and time again, Peter, be good, Peter, be quiet, Peter, don't jump, Peter, don't move, don't sneeze, don't cough, because we were literally a sneeze away from being arrested while we were hiding in various places. Some of them pretty ordinary, were living in people's homes, but at times we were in cupboards and in holes dug out of the ground or in roof cavities or cellars. So, but again, as a child, I've always considered myself to have been fortunate to have been a child in those days, because I did not have any responsibilities for making any decisions, nor did I understand what the consequences were of being caught. You don't tell your 4 or 5 year old child, if you get caught, you get killed. That's not what parents do. So they had the fear and the responsibility and the decisions to make. They had the grief to deal with their parents and brothers and sisters gone. So yes, I've always considered myself to be fortunate to have been a child in those days, and I'm sure that is still true. My mother was permanently, very seriously damaged psychologically, and even in Australia, she struggled with that for the rest of her life. Dad was more physically hurt, and he seemed to deal with the mental side of it, the grief side of it, better than Mum. But, maybe he just hid it or dealt with it better. I'm not saying that he grieved less. I have missed my friends. I never had childhood friends, in the sense that, I lost my childhood friends at the age of 5, and never really had a chance to develop lifelong friends in the 4 years of 1945 to 1949, while we were back in our home in Bratislava.
When did your family go into hiding?
In 1942.
Okay. And I would imagine that would have been quite isolating for you.
Very, very, because I was totally and only with Mum and Dad. And sometimes only with one of them, because often there was no room for 3 of us in one hiding place, and I went either with Mum or Dad. So yes, it was very isolating. And again, that's part of when I say I had no childhood. It's a part truth. It's not the whole truth, but it's, for 3 years, and then in concentration camp, I had no childhood. We in fact ran out of hiding places because the people who hid us took enormous risks with their own lives and the lives of their family in order to hide us, because the law was at the time that anybody caught hiding Jews or any of the other minorities which were being hunted, these people took enormous risks, and eventually my parents decided that they couldn't take that risk with the people that were good enough to hide us, because they hid us for nothing. We had nothing to give them or offer them or promise them. And we eventually walked into a police station and gave ourselves up because we'd run out of options. And it's then that we were arrested and we were sent off to concentration camps.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Peter Gasper, a Holocaust survivor discussing the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. Do you remember when you first got to the concentration camp?
The journey was very, very tough because we were put into transport cattle in cattle wagons. In other words, no view outside, just 200 people in one wagon. So you can imagine that you wouldn't put that many people into a railway carriage, let alone a cattle wagon. And there was no light, and there was no food, and there was nowhere to sit. You had to stand up, and you didn't know where you were going, and you didn't know when you would get there or what would happen to you when you did get there. So it was, and that took about 2 days until we arrived somewhere, and we still didn't know where we were. And when you did get told to get out, there were already several people who had died along on the trip. So that's fairly tough for a kid. I was separated from my mother. I was put into a boys' home, and with very limited food rations and no program of any sort. So all I remember of that boys' home is that I was permanently cold because I shared the third level of a 3-tier bunk with 3 other boys my age. No bed linen, no pillow, and 1 blanket between us. And outside it was minus 20 degrees. So it was tough. And the food rations were such that we were permanently hungry and cold and lonely and afraid. And when you're bored, then you're hungrier and colder. You got more time to think about how lonely you are. Not good.
Do you remember the day that you were liberated by the Russians?
Yes, on the 8th of May 1945, in the children's home, which was on the edge of the camp. I was on the second, 1 floor up from the ground, dormitory. When we heard in the morning, early in the morning, about 7 o'clock, we heard rumbling of very heavy rumbling, which was unusual, and we didn't know what it was. So we scratched the sort of newspaper that was stuck on the window in order to make it obscure, right? You couldn't see out. But we scratched that off with our fingers, and we saw tanks with a red flag, and one of the kids must have known what the red flag was all about. And he said, "Oh, the Russians are here." So that meant that we were liberated, and that was it.
When you were reunited with your parents, did you notice that was there anything different about them? Like, had the war and the Holocaust changed them?
Well, Dad lost about 30 kilos in weight while he was in camp, and my mother not as much, but similarly, they were physically in very bad shape, and they were trauma. I mean, now I would use the word traumatized, but not then. Not as a child. I wouldn't use that word. Not certainly not in English. Let alone Slovak. They were more abrupt, yes, and at the same time they lavished on me as much as they possibly could, because how shall I put it? I was now more precious than ever. Many of my friends and the children of their friends had perished, and I didn't. So I was, in that respect, sort of a miracle child, if you like. Or we took a long time to recover our health, or a long time, maybe a year or two, and then we was fortunate in being able to go on holidays, and so in a sense, my parents have possibly indulged themselves in an effort to sort of make up for lost time, if you like.
You mentioned a little bit in earlier in the interview about how your mother was very psychologically affected by the Holocaust. Did she ever find it hard to talk about the things and the experiences she had as a part of the Holocaust? Yes, very, very hard. And my dad, what I know more from my dad, not from Mum. I would never talk about it with Mum. Mum couldn't cope with that. Holocaust survivors
Holocaust survivors fall into, in that respect, into several categories. There are those people who can't talk about anything else. It is their life-defining event. It is who they are. They are Holocaust survivors, and their whole life is if you like, it's the context of their whole life.
Mm.
And then there are people, because they've been so traumatized, they will not talk about it at all. There's a line ruled on the page of their life, and they will not talk about anything above that line.
Mm. Do the experiences of the Holocaust still affect you?
Yes. I didn't realize how much it affected me for many years. While I was growing up in Australia, and growing up was tough in the sense that I had battled with English and therefore schooling, and I was different, not only just because of my language, but because of my cultural behaviour, the cultural context within which I behaved. I wore for a long time different clothes because we brought clothes from Europe. And, when we were in boarding school, the one weekend a month that we were allowed away from boarding school, a lot of kids went from time to time for sleepovers at friends' place. They didn't go home, but they would go to a friend's place for the weekend. I was never invited to go for a weekend to anybody's place. And because we lived in a small apartment where there was absolutely no possibility for me inviting anybody. So that in itself made me an outsider, or made me feel even more of an outsider. So I grew up a loner, and that's something which I'm still a loner. I have a lot of friends, but I'm very, very comfortable with my own company, and I can't remember the last time I went to have a coffee with somebody. And the experience of those years came out later on, and I felt somehow, I don't know how shall I put it, less worthy. I've never had a good self-image.
Okay.
I never had the self-confidence, and that also affected my working career. I never had the self-confidence to go for jobs which I would have been fully capable of doing, because I didn't feel I was up to it. I have tertiary qualifications, and in my job, in fact, I traveled overseas on business for my company quite extensively. But in another way, there were jobs which I could have applied for had I had the guts. To put it plainly, I didn't have the guts to go for it. I've also sort of developed a sense of humour which is self-deprecating. I sort of, So that's a sort of long-term effects. I used to have very bad dreams for many years. Fortunately, those have largely stopped. Although my wife said to me the other day that I trashed around and called out things the other night. So it occasionally still happens. But unfortunately, not anymore. I work as I'm 85 years old, so I've been retired for about 20 years. But I've worked as a volunteer in the Jewish community all those years, and I still do in children's education, in students' education. I work with a program called Courage to Care. And I've been working with that program for 25 years now, and I've seen and spoken and worked with many tens of thousands of students. It's something which I do because of what I experienced in terms of racism, and I do what I can to not to let it happen again.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Peter Gasper, a Holocaust survivor discussing the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. You highlighted some of those long-term effects, Peter, of the Holocaust. Do you think it would have been really helpful if there was mental health support back in the late 1940s and early 50s for the people that had survived the Holocaust?
Oh, I'm sure it would have been. It would have been, I think, very helpful for children particularly. I don't know how much adults would have taken advantage of it, because that generation of my parents, going to a psychologist, let alone a psychiatrist, meant that you were sick. You were sick in the head, and it was the last thing they would say about themselves. It was the last thing they would admit to themselves, let alone anybody else, that they were sick in the head. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Today, psychologists, every school has got a psychologist, if not more, right?
Yeah.
Or a student counselor.
Yep.
And especially during the COVID times, I challenge you to get an appointment with a psychologist. They're like they're booked out forever.
Yep.
But in those days, there were very few around, and actually, in my early 30s, I tried to get help from someone, several people, and in fact, they were pretty incompetent well, they didn't meet my needs.
Yep.
Yeah, so yes, certainly it would have been of help if they had been available, if they had been competent, and if people had the time, the money, and the confidence to go to them. Because you've got to go to these people with confidence.
Yes.
If you go in there with a negative attitude, then they're not going to do you any good. If you go to a hypnotist determined not to be hypnotized, they're not going to do it.
Why do you think it's important we talk about mental health, Peter?
Because mental health is a part of your general health. If you're not healthy in mind, you're not going to be healthy in body. It goes the other way around as well, for that matter. I think if you're not healthy in body, you have a much harder time of being healthy in mind. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
And there are lots of pressures. There are lots of pressures on young people and working people. I think more so than before. You have a large section of a population with a very limited working week because all they can get is casual jobs and often on contract jobs, so there's no security, and they're possibly working less than they would like to. So there is there's a great need, and not enough available for people. Oh, look, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. What can you expect the government to provide? I'm not a great believer in what is called the nanny. Are you familiar with the expression, the nanny state?
No, I'm not familiar, Peter.
The state, the country, the government that looks after you from cradle to the grave.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get what you're saying
right?
now. Yep.
I'm not a believer in that. I don't think that breeds a healthy society when you are all the time dependent on somebody else to take care of you. It doesn't create resilience amongst people, and I think resilience is very important. Resilience is what brought me through and my parents through, and so many other people through. No, you don't have to be a Holocaust survivor to be resilient.
What would be your advice then to young people that might be struggling with a few things like mental health?
Get involved in group activities. Sport is a group activity which is sort of traditionally the Australian way, get into sport. Not everybody's into sport. Not everybody's good at it or wants to be even good at it. But there are other opportunities for group activities. And I think that is very important. Being a part of a team of people doing something for somebody else, and take the focus off yourself. People who are loners tend to be self-absorbed, looking always inwards into themselves, if you like. You need to get out of that, and doing something for other people is good medicine.
Well, Peter, from all we've kind of talked about, the Holocaust, your life, this connection with mental health, what would be the take-home for our listeners? What would be the take-home from this interview you'd want them to remember the most?
I think we all can make a difference in the lives of other people, depending on the choices we make. We all have the power to contribute to the wellness of other people, to the wellness of the community, the society we live in, if we are conscious, if we become conscious of our ability to do this, and if we make the choice to do it. So I tell the students I work with that you make a 1,000, maybe 10,000 choices every day, and very few of them matter in the long run. What cereal you have for breakfast is doesn't matter a hoot, but how you behave towards other people makes a difference. It can make a difference in their life, and it will make a difference in your own life, because how you behave towards other people defines you. It defines who you are, not only to other people, but it defines you to yourself. Well, I think that's a message which is worth thinking about.
Well, it was a privilege talking with you today, Peter. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for your call. I appreciate it too.
My guest today was Holocaust survivor Peter Gasper, talking about the mental health impacts of the Holocaust. Tune in next week, where we continue discussing the mental health impacts of the Holocaust with another survivor. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.